The headlines are a calculated misdirection. Reports from Flight Global detail Russia adding anti-aircraft missiles to Shahed drones. This is presented as the next evolution of kinetic warfare. It is not. The focus on low-cost missiles is a deliberate distraction, designed to keep Western threat models focused on physical explosions and battlefield assets. The real vector is silent. The protocol is not to create rubble, it is to create a void. The actual target is not a tank battalion. It is the global nervous system, the thousands of miles of undersea fiber optic cables that transmit nearly all transcontinental data. An adversary facing existential economic pressure, per the Venezuelan precedent, has zero incentive to engage in a symmetric fight. Their mathematical imperative is to attack the architecture of communication itself. This triggers a condition that analysts at CSIS refer to as the blind leviathan. The Western financial system is a leviathan, a vast, hyper-leveraged organism dependent on a constant real-time flow of data. Cutting its optic nerves, the undersea cables, or blinding its satellite eyes does not require a single kinetic impact on Western soil. It paralyzes the entity. Without data, it cannot price assets, clear transactions, or measure risk. It thrashes, creating a systemic solvency crisis from within. This is not a missile strike. It is induced paralysis. It is a weapon that turns the system's own complexity and leverage against itself. A risk now being quietly modeled in forums like the Bank Policy Institute's December 2025 exchange. The motive is not conquest. It is survival. A protracted conventional war is a domestic liability of the highest order. It drains the treasury and erodes political capital. RUSI analysis confirms that for a state like Russia, such a war becomes an existential solvency crisis for the leadership itself. The Kremlin is not fighting a war for territory, it is fighting to prevent an internal collapse triggered by external economic pressure. This pivot to asymmetry is not a choice. It is a mathematical certainty forced by Western policy. Actions like the U.S. seizure of Russian-flagged tankers are not interpreted as negotiating tactics. They are read as the preliminary stages of a full-spectrum economic siege, identical to the blueprint used against Venezuela. The Venezuelan precedent is the ghost in the machine. A nation that was once among the world's richest, crippled by economic warfare. For a state facing this outcome, capitulation is not an option. The only logical protocol is to escalate asymmetrically, because the cost of inaction is total systemic failure. Therefore, conventional weakness forces a strategic pivot. If you cannot afford a billion-dollar air force, you engineer a solution that makes your adversary's billion-dollar air force a liability. The Russian modification of Shahed drones with anti-aircraft missiles is the physical manifestation of this doctrine. It is not designed to win air superiority. It is designed to increase the kinetic cost for the West to operate within the theater. Each drone is a vector, transmitting physical risk directly into the West's financial architecture. The goal is not to sink a fleet, but to make the insurance premiums for that fleet untenable. The motive is to trade a domestic solvency crisis for a systemic one abroad. The Bank Policy Institute's future research, dated December 2025, will not be a surprise. It will be the ledger documenting the consequences of this exact protocol. The central protocol of modern conflict is no longer about winning on a battlefield. It is about the economics of lethality. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, place the unit cost of a modern main battle tank at approximately $5 million. The cost of a first-person view kinetic drone used to achieve its asset liquidation is around $500. That is not a simple transaction. It is a mathematical inversion of power. This is the democratization of violence. This economic asymmetry means the capacity for strategic destruction is no longer the exclusive domain of states with trillion-dollar budgets. When a nation faces existential economic pressure, the blueprint established by the collapse in Venezuela and weaponized through actions like tanker seizures, it is forced to innovate. The objective is not to build a $5 million tank, it is to build $10,500 threats that can neutralize that tank. This creates a systemic liability. This is a launch-on-warning protocol for economic warfare. Each sanction, each seized asset, is an accelerant. It incentivizes the adversary to engineer cheaper, more effective kinetic vectors, like the reported adaptation of Shahed platforms with anti-aircraft capabilities. The goal is not parity. It is to create unpredictable, high-cost events that transmit risk directly from the physical domain into the West's primary vulnerability, its hyper-leveraged financial architecture. The kinetic cost is low, but the potential solvency crisis it can trigger is infinite. The battlefield is not where you are told to look. It is not a trench line. The real staging ground for the next systemic shock is the gray zone, geopolitical vacuums where the rules of engagement are suspended. CSIS analysts identify these zones by their core attributes: high resource value, internal political fragility, and porous state control. These are not failed states. They are proxy laboratories. Public warnings from governments about travel to regions like South Africa or even specific Canadian territories are not humanitarian alerts. They are faint signals of active experimentation. These are the environments where the protocol of asymmetric escalation is stress-tested and refined. The blueprint is derived from the Venezuelan precedent. A state rich in oil wealth, is subjected to maximalist economic warfare, including tanker seizures as documented by Reuters. Faced with a zero-sum choice between total collapse or radical innovation, the state is mathematically incentivized to weaponize its environment. This is where the gray zone becomes the accelerator. Within these labs, state and non-state actors test the deployment of low-cost, high-impact kinetic systems. The objective is not military victory. The objective is to create an uninsurable liability. The Flight Global report on Russia, adding anti-aircraft capabilities to cheap Shahed drones, is the graduation certificate of this strategy. The drone is not aimed at a fighter jet. It's aimed at a civilian airliner or a commodity shipping route. This is kinetic cost injection. It transmits physical risk directly into the West's financial architecture, forcing a repricing of global logistics. It's a launch-on-warning protocol against solvency itself. The existence of a Bank Policy Institute research exchange on future risks is the admission. The financial system is modeling for a black swan event, but they are looking in the wrong direction. The threat is not a singular event. It's the systemic proliferation of these gray zone laboratories, each exporting weaponized risk until a critical liquidity failure is triggered. The math doesn't lie. The Cold War doctrine of launch-on-warning is not a historical artifact. It is a live, systemic protocol hardwired into the command structure. The logic is irrefutable. A nation that absorbs a first strike before retaliating loses its C3I, command, control, and intelligence, and thus its ability to launch a counterstrike. Therefore, the only winning move is not to play for survival, but to launch on the warning of an inbound attack, not on its impact. CSIS analysis confirms this protocol is not a choice. It is a mathematical function of game theory. If incoming vectors are detected and verified, the protocol dictates immediate, full-scale retaliation. Waiting for detonation is a zero-sum outcome resulting in strategic nullification. The system is engineered to prioritize retaliation capability over absolute certainty. This creates the central vulnerability of the 21st century, the fog of digital war. An adversary facing existential economic pressure following the Venezuelan precedent does not need to build a single missile. They only need to execute a successful cyber attack that blinds or spoofs the early warning radar systems. If the screens go black, or worse, display phantom inbound vectors, the commander is trapped. The protocol is triggered. The data is unverified, but the clock is ticking. Is it a solar flare, a system error, or a decapitation strike already underway? The doctrine of launch-on-warning forces their hand. The fear of inaction and the kinetic cost it represents is the true weapon. This is the end game of asymmetric escalation. Economic warfare incentivizes the weaponization of doubt. It costs billions to maintain a nuclear triad, but only a fraction of that to develop the digital key that can force its launch. The same strategic innovation that adds anti-air missiles to Shahed drones is being applied to our digital infrastructure. The objective is not to win a war, it is to trigger a systemic solvency crisis, with analysts at institutions like the Bank Policy Institute modeling the financial fallout of such a kinetic event as we approach December 2025. The protocol is initiated not by a declaration of war, but by a legal document, a seizure warrant for an oil tanker. Western economic warfare, validated by U.S. actions against Russian-flagged and Venezuelan-tied vessels, operates on the assumption of a passive target. This assumption is a systemic flaw. A state algorithmically pushed toward the Venezuelan precedent, total economic collapse, is not incentivized to surrender. It is mathematically incentivized to innovate. The objective shifts from national survival to exporting systemic liability directly into the West's financial architecture. The blueprint for this response vector is now public. As documented by Flight Global, Russia's integration of anti-air missiles onto Shahed drones is a proof of concept for low-cost systems neutralizing high-cost assets. The logical evolution, according to our USI analysts, is a kinetic payload targeting static, critical infrastructure with plausible deniability. The calibration forecast. Within the next 12 months, expect a coordinated, non-attributable blackout at a Tier 1 North American container port. The event will not be a large-scale explosion, but a precise, cascading power failure originating outside the primary grid, targeting backup generators and data interchange hubs. It will last 48-72 hours, time to maximize disruption to cargo clearing systems. This is not an act of war. It is a market signal, a kinetic cost in the low millions to generate a systemic liability measured in the trillions as insurance underwriters reprice global political risk. It is a single data point to test the solvency architecture ahead of a potential 2025 systemic event, the type of scenario under review by the Bank Policy Institute. The target was never the port. It was the balance sheet.